Welcome back to Mad Hatter's Civil War History. In today's episode, we examine the Battle of Gettysburg and General George Sears Greene's heroic contributions to the defense of Culp's Hill. General George Sears Greene led the way on Culp's Hill on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. Union left had almost broken late on the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, the second day of fighting around Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Lieutenant General James Longstreet's rebels had hit the Federals hard for more than an hour, with the 15th and 47th Alabama storming up Little Round Top, the key high ground on the Union left flank. The heroics of Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and the 20th Maine, among others, prevented the hill's capture. Major General George G. Meade, commanding the Union Army of the Potomac at Gettysburg, responded to the threat on his left by ordering up reinforcements just after 6 p.m. Reserve units from Major General John Sedgwick's 6th Corps brigades from Meade's old 5th Corps and battered portions of the 1st Corps all answered his call. Meade then called for the 12th Corps, which was guarding the Union right on Culp's Hill. Upon receiving Meade's instructions, Major General Henry Slocum, normally the commander of the Union 12th Corps, but at Gettysburg the commander of the Army's right wing, requested permission to leave one of his 2 divisions on Culp's Hill as a precaution. But Meade was adamant in his call for all available troops and allowed Slocum to pick only 1 brigade to stay behind. So Slocum made his choice. The weight of Meade's questionable decision would fall on the shoulders of Brigadier General George Sears Greene, an austere 62-year-old Rhode Islander who commanded a veteran brigade of New Yorkers, the 3rd Brigade of the 12th Corps, 2nd Division. Strengthening the Union left at the expense of the right nearly proved a calamity to the whole army, Colonel Lewis R. Stegman of the 102nd New York and Greene's brigade later wrote. It was a suicidal move. Meade had taken a risky gamble that his right was secure for the day, even though Confederate batteries had just exchanged fire with Federal artillery on Culp's Hill between 4 and 5 p.m. Greene, however, approached the predicament calmly. As a descendant of Nathanael Greene, George Washington's second in command, and as a father of 2 Union soldiers and a Federal naval officer, Greene seemed to have Yankee blue in his blood. He had graduated 2nd in his class from the U.S. Military Academy and afterwards spent 13 years in uniform. For the next 25 years, he worked as a civil engineer, rising to the top ranks of his profession before the Civil War drew him back into the Army. At ease, Greene looked more like a kindly preacher than a soldier, but he could conjure up a fierce gaze that, coupled with his commanding voice, made subordinates scramble. One of his soldier sons, Francis Vinton Greene, described him as a very strict disciplinarian who demanded unquestioning obedience to his orders. In essence, he demanded that his troops respect him, and they did. Eventually, he even won their affection. When Greene first arrived at Culp's Hill early on the morning of July 2nd, he immediately realized his position demanded breastworks. Disregarding the objections of his division commander, Brigadier General John Geary, Greene ordered construction to begin. Captain Jesse H. Jones of the 60th New York noted that the men took to the task eagerly because they instinctively felt that a life-and-death struggle was impending and that every help should be used. Fortunately, the hillside yielded ample supplies for their work. The result was an imposing rampart of wood, stone, and earth that would give the Confederate attackers few targets. The breastworks offered a measure of security, but the fact remained that Greene's troops on the hill's ridge held an incredibly vulnerable and tenuous position. When the other 5 12th Corps brigades headed south in response to Meade's order just before 7 p.m., Greene's 5 regiments, a total of 1,350 men, had to occupy all of the vacated works. As dusk set in, Greene ordered his 60th, 78th, 102nd, 137th, and 149th New York to stretch out in a line 1 man deep, with 1 foot of space between the men. The fortified trenches were nearly half a mile long, and as Greene inspected them, he wondered if he had enough manpower to hold his ground. It was already too late to do anything more than wonder, however. By 7:15 p.m., skirmishers led by Lieutenant Colonel John C.O. Reddington of the 60th New York spotted Confederates crossing Rock Creek near the foot of Culp's Hill. As the drab, butternut and gray mass approached, the skirmishers fired a few volleys and raced up the rocky wooded hill for the safety of the breastworks. As they frantically leapt over the works, Greene dispatched a courier to the 11th Corps commander, Major General Oliver O. Howard, and to Brigadier General James S. Wadsworth of the 1st Corps, 1st Division, with an urgent plea for reinforcements. The Confederate advance was long overdue. Miscommunication and vacillation had plagued Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia all day. Lee had planned for Longstreet's 1st Corps to attack the Federal left, while Lieutenant General Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps hit the Union right. He later amended the plan so that Longstreet would attack after Ewell first made a feint. Ideally, Ewell's display would then expand into a full assault. This scheme, originally set to unfold in the morning, was postponed until the late afternoon due to logistical failures and poor communication. As dusk settled in, Ewell launched an entire division at Greene's single understrength brigade. 3 brigades of Maryland, North Carolina, Virginia, and Louisiana troops under the command of Major General Edward Johnson waded through Rock Creek and stormed up the rise through the near darkness created by the canopy of leaves that blocked the fading sun. Johnson's 4th Brigade, the famed Stonewall Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General James Walker, had been engaged with Union forces to the east of Brinkerhoff Ridge. Walker had orders to rejoin the division as soon as possible, but he deemed it more prudent to protect the division's flank and rear with his tired-out troops. Random shots rang out as the Confederates approached the top of Culp's Hill. Federals crouched anxiously behind their bulwarks, listening to the ominous footfalls in the woods. Suddenly, the lead corporate ranks appeared out of the shadows, and Greene's officers ordered the New Yorkers to open fire. Out into the night, the chain lightning leaped the zigzag line of fire, recalled the 60th New York's Captain Jones. Scores of Southerners dropped as the New Yorkers burst of flames, and lead found its mark. Rebel officers pulled their shocked troops back into the woods to regroup. For the adrenaline-charged Union troops, the respite was brief. Their shaken attackers reorganized quickly and opened fire from behind large rocks and trees. But it soon became clear that with the Federals heavily entrenched on high ground and shrouded in darkness and smoke, Johnson's men could not capture the hill with long-range fire. The order to charge came again. About 8 p.m., Confederates from Virginia and Maryland, under the command of Brigadier General George H. Stewart, assaulted Greene's extreme right. Holding the position were the 456 men of Colonel David Ireland's 137th New York, a hefty regiment by mid-war standards. As the Confederate fire intensified, the 71st Pennsylvania arrived to reinforce the hill. Greene immediately posted them to Ireland's right, momentarily slowing Stewart's momentum. Strangely, however, the 71st stayed on the line only long enough to exchange several volleys with the Confederates, then withdrew suddenly at the height of the attack. Such an unintelligible retreat left the Union right, as Greene put it, in a very critical position. About this time, units from the 1st and 11th Corps began to reach Culp's Hill. The 14th Brooklyn, 6th Wisconsin, and 147th New York arrived first. Greene sent the 147th New York into the heart of his lines, the 6th Wisconsin, under the command of Colonel Rufus Dawes, to take and hold the breastworks to the 137th New York's right, and the 14th Brooklyn to Ireland's immediate aid. Ireland, whose men had been fielding fire from 3 sides, desperately moved his line through the dark, smoky air behind a traverse of stacked wood, rocks, and brush that stood perpendicular to the brigade line. His new position faced the attackers and temporarily kept them at bay, but he needed more men to hold it. The Federal reinforcements arrived just in time to help stop Stuart's determined troops. Even though they gained part of the vacant Union works, the attacking Virginians and Marylanders were unable to push through the thin, defiant line. Meanwhile, the fighting raged on all along the line. On Greene's left, 6 regiments of Virginians under the command of Brigadier General John Marshall Jones tangled with the 60th and 102nd New York. In the center, Brigadier General Francis R. Nichols' 5 Louisiana regiments stormed the works in front of the 78th and 149th New Yorkers. With help from the 82nd Illinois, 45th New York, and 61st Ohio of Howard's 11th Corps, however, Greene's troops on the left and at the center held fast. The Confederates made 4 separate charges between 7 and 10 p.m., but each met the same bloody end. Though 755 men from the 1st and 11th Corps bolstered the 5 New York regiments, Greene never had more than 1,350 troops in line to face 4,000 to 5,000 Confederates. He maintained his blistering defense of the hill by using his limited resources wisely, rotating troops to and from the battle line to restock their cartridge boxes and clean their weapons. The eager Union troops cheered on their comrades as they raced back and forth, pushing each other to greater and greater heights of fervor and determination. Greene rode up and down the line, showing no regard for his personal welfare. About 10 p.m., the Confederates' attack ceased, though sporadic musket fire continued for some time. At the same time, Union Brigadier General Thomas Kane's 2nd Brigade of the 2nd Division returned and was followed soon by other 12th Corps units. For the second time that day, a Union flank had been, but not broken. The left flank had been severely pressed on Little Round Top, but Chamberlain and his 20th Maine had stood firm. Now the right flank had been tested, and it too had been saved by a small, gutsy force and a gallant leader. Fire opened up again about 4 a.m. the next day as the Confederates tried one last time to take Culp's Hill. But lacking a demonstration by Longstreet on the Union left, and with the entire Union 12th Corps back in place on the hill, 3 more Confederate attacks proved fruitless. Ewell withdrew his frustrated forces late in the morning, and tired Federal troops fetched water down at Rock Creek. There they tallied the awesome price their foes had paid trying to unseat them. Greene reported 391 dead rebels immediately in front of his works. He found another 150 corpses on the creek's banks and roughly 2,000 muskets strewn all over the hill. Adding the 130 prisoners captured, Greene estimated the Confederate losses at 2,400, including several officers. By contrast, the 3rd Brigade's losses amounted to a mere 307 killed, wounded, and missing. Greene's service as a field commander did not end at Gettysburg. The aging general fought on until the Confederate bullets struck him in the face at the Battle of Waxahachie, Tennessee, in October of 1863. Though he briefly returned to the battlefield in 1865, his duty had been served. He was brevetted a Major General of Volunteers before he marched in the Grand Review of the Armies in Washington just after the war. He performed his last act as an officer as a member of a courts-martial panel on which he served until early 1866. After the war, Greene returned to civil engineering and worked diligently to compile his proud family's genealogy. He lived until 1899, a vigorous old war-horse until the end. The magnitude of Greene's heroic defense of Culp's Hill cannot easily be overstated. Had Ewell's force overwhelmed the small Union force, the Federal rear would have been exposed to direct attack, and the Army of the Potomac, with the Confederates already in place in its left and center fronts, would have been encircled. The fight that Greene's stalwart men put up on the night of July 2nd ranks among the best of any Civil War brigade. Anything less than their tireless, courageous effort would have given the Confederates victory. Greene offered his troops his hearty commendations for the good rendered their country. Greene also credited Slocum, who had seen the danger in leaving the hill unprotected, with having saved the army from a great and perhaps fatal disaster. Although Greene credited others for the victory, he was the true hero. Since his re-entry into the Army as the 60th New York's colonel in January of 1862, his hard-driving style had brought him much praise and a promotion. He had led a division at Antietam in September of 1862, skillfully managing limited resources to give his men every advantage possible. At Gettysburg, Greene remained conspicuous, constantly moving along his lines to encourage his besieged troops. Greene's most important contribution at Gettysburg was his early morning decision to construct breastworks. At that point in the war, many officers on both sides still opposed their use. Confederate General John Bell Hood, for example, felt that they would imperil that spirit of devil-may-care independence and self-reliance that supposedly helped make Confederate troops effective. Some thought breastworks diminished soldiers' courage. Not Greene. He believed human lives were too important to be sacrificed to bravado and unproved theories. Without the protection of breastworks, Greene's heavily outnumbered brigade probably would have been swept from that hill, to the great peril of the Union Army. Under Greene's direction, the works were perfectly located and constructed not only to protect the defenders, but also to conceal them. Thus, the 4,000 to 5,000 attackers did not know their enemy was a mere 1,350 men. Greene's 25 years as an engineer, designing and building railroads and waterworks such as the Central Park Reservoir in New York City had paid off, and his aggressive leadership style made him the ideal man to lead the defense of Culp's Hill. Joshua Chamberlain became a national hero after the Battle of Gettysburg. Glory, however, did not immediately come to George Sears Greene. Part of the reason for Greene's relative obscurity is that even his fellow Rhode Islanders were slow to lionize him. They reserved most of their adulation for another native of their state, the equally devoted but less skilled Major General Ambrose E. Burnside, partly because Burnside had marched off the war in 1861 in command of the Rhode Islanders. Greene, on the other hand, was employed in New York when the war broke out, and he received his commission in 1862 from the Empire State's Governor, Edwin Morgan. Consequently, he led New York troops almost exclusively during the war. Still, the main factor in Greene's passage into obscurity may well have been that Meade did not properly credit Greene or his scrappy New York troops in his official report on the Gettysburg campaign. Slocum waged a lively campaign to correct that oversight. On December 30th, 1863, he wrote a letter to Meade proclaiming the failure of the enemy to gain possession of our works was due entirely to the skill of General Greene and the heroic valor of his troops. Meade's failure to acknowledge that fact in his report, the letter continued, was an injustice which not even time can correct. Meade agreed that Greene's efforts were heroic and countered that he did not properly credit the Rhode Island general only because his subordinates had misinformed him. He made some meek attempts to have the record changed, but with little effect. Others had immediately realized the importance of Greene's efforts and had never forgotten it. At an 1888 ceremony to dedicate a monument to the 3rd Brigade, Longstreet gave Greene and his New Yorkers the credit of having successfully prevented the Confederates from turning Meade's right flank. Longstreet, a friend of Greene's in the antebellum U.S. Army and a circumstantial enemy at Gettysburg, left Greene that day in 1888 with the highest praise. There was no better officer in either army. It's your history. Learn it, know it, love it. Like and follow so you don't miss any of the exciting episodes from Mad Hatter's Civil War history.